So Zhivka Valiavicharska, I'm so sorry if I didn't get it right, but she's a political theorist and art historian working on the social, political, and cultural histories in Bulgaria, the Balkans, and Eastern Europe during the socialist and post-socialist periods in a global context. She's the author of Restless History, Political Imaginaries and Their Discontents in Post-Stalinist Bulgaria. Currently, she is Associate Professor of Political and Social Theory at Pratt Institute, New York. The floor is yours, Zhivka.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your invitation. It's my honor to be here. It's really wonderful to be here and to contribute to this wonderful forum that I have been following since I became aware of it. And thank you for extending, it's really an honor, this invitation to me and to my colleagues to contribute from the East European perspectives and experiences, and in particular from the socialist world. And I hope that my contribution is in the spirit of kind of further decolonizing the historiographies of the political movements globally. And by kind of tracing these lost and forgotten global connections and sort of solidarities between the East and the South forged in the 60s and the 70s. So I will be taking you to a very concrete context in the 70s in socialist Bulgaria, something that I've been working on. It's going to be focused, my presentation is going to be focused on this one public monument from the 1970s. It's called the Bratska Mogila. It's very hard to translate, so this is why I will just leave it at that. I have a PowerPoint, so I will share my screen. Excuse me. Okay. So the Bratska Mogila, Plovdiv's public monument, the Bratska Mogila, quietly rests on the west side of the city, nestled near a large green forested park in a modern socialist neighborhood. Completed in 1974, the monument was built to harbor the remains of anti-fascist partisans, communists, and working class activists who lost their lives in the resistance against fascism in the region of Plovdiv before and during World War II. The monument was conceived in the spirit of the socialist humanist tradition during the post-Stalinist era, the creation of a socialist modernity involved in the contemporary and historical reorderings of the world. It constructs a narrative that draws connections between the struggles for national independence, the socialist working class movement, the history of the anti-fascist resistance in the country, and the socialist revolution, weaving them into a unified storyline of the revolutionary history of the Bulgarian people. The meanings embedded in its form and content capture the cultural logics of its time in the context of a new world historical moment. A sort of symbiosis of nationalism and universalism, it realigns Bulgarian and local revolutionary history with the formation of decolonial worlds and global alternatives to Western hegemony. The Bratska Mogila has a unique architecture and conceptual design and is holistically integrated into the recreational infrastructure of the city. The structure of the monument itself is made out of 14 angular plates of concrete anchored deep into the ground, forming a semi-enclosed circle. The shape of the structure resembles a flower or a mound and makes a visual and conceptual reference to the ancient burial sites of the Thracian people, or the Thracian Mogilas, offering a modern interpretation of their form. The visitor enters the ground level of the monument by walking down a slowly descending ramp. Moving down the ramp feels like a procession in slow motion. It makes the transition from daily life into a different spiritual dimension, a passage into the abodes of the dead, into the sacred and eternal realms. Once inside the Mogila, we succumb into a wondrous circular space sliced open into the skies by the angular shapes of the concrete blocks. The skies enter the space in a rhythmic pattern made by the zigzagging edges of the concrete blocks. The shadows of their angular shapes rotate in a circular way throughout the day like a giant sundial, and they create a unique interplay of light and shadow. This dynamic lighting further animates the rhythmic patterns of the elements inside. The center of the circle is highlighted by a bronze wreath, where many of us remember an eternal flame was ablaze, a burning flame of fire sustained day and night. The monument thereby presents a space that is neither fully underground nor above ground, neither fully open nor enclosed, combining angular and circular architectural forms in a perfect balance. A quiet equilibrium emerges. Out of this dynamic interchange of opposites, it transcends ordinary temporality and touches the higher dimensions. The Bratska Mogila was designed as part of an open competition in 1967, and the following year, the city contracted a team of architects and sculptors to design and supervise the construction of the project. The architects of the structure were Lyubomir Shinkov and Vladimir Arangilov, two prominent figures who were involved in shaping the architecture and urban space of socialist modernity from Plovdiv, Bulgaria, to the independent post-colonial nations in North Africa. In Plovdiv, Shinkov was known for several public buildings, such as the movie theater Komsomol, which became a landmark example of the socialist modernist architecture from the 1960s. As a young architect, Shinkov spent the years between 61 and 65 in Tunisia, where he and his colleagues were assigned diverse large-scale projects that carried great responsibility. He created the modular designs for the people's housing built in different parts of the country, restored architectural sites of world historical significance, such as the Great Mosque in Kairouan from the 7th century, and redesigned the layout of the administrative and cultural center of Kairouan. Shinkov also designed primary schools, mosques, hotels, cultural centers, urban and inner city infrastructure, and more. His work helped shape the modern urban aesthetic of post-colonial Tunisia, and his designs were remarkable for their harmonious integration into pre-existing public space and the rich architectural heritage of the Tunisian cities. There, Shinkov was influenced by the historic and modern North African Islamic architectural tradition, weaving abstract and rhythmic geometric patterns into his modernist visions, a style that resonated in his designs after his return to socialist Bulgaria. The Bratska Mogila, along with other works of architecture and urban development from the period, should be seen in the context of the alternative modernities that the socialist and post-colonial nations forged, and in the context of socialist, non-aligned, and non-Western modernisms. The relations between the socialist world and the post-colonial countries has had tremendous influence on the shape of global politics between the late 50s and the 80s, at the height of the anti-colonial liberation movements in Africa and global movements against racism and imperialism. These convergences were involved in forging distinct economic, social, and cultural worlds alternative to global capitalist development and resistant to Western hegemonies. Yet this history has been marginalized, disavowed, and neglected, not in small part due to the fall of the socialist governments in Eastern Europe, and also because of the rigid binaries pervading our understanding of global politics during the 20th century, including analysis focusing on Cold War and East-West and North-South and even South-South relations and geopolitical dynamics. A recent body of work has returned to these histories to forcefully challenge existing narratives. It shows that the relations between the socialist world and the post-colonial countries were not unidirectional, but multifaceted, marked by a multipolarity of interactions and dynamics. A growing number of scholars, some of whom have already spoken here, are tracing and recovering alternative routes and locations where anti-colonial politics with anti-capitalist visions emerged and thrived during the period of decolonization. Here, in this context, I want to mention the work of art historian Bojana Videkanic, who has written on non-aligned modernism in the context of former Yugoslavia. Also, architecture historian Lukac Stanek explores the political, cultural, and material possibilities that architecture and urban planning presented to the former socialist countries and the newly independent states in Africa and the Middle East. His research highlights the extensive contributions of East European architects and engineers in the modernization of post-colonial cities such as Lagos, Baghdad, Abu Dhabi, and Kuwait, from North Africa and North and West Africa to the Middle East. These architectural and material realities were part of what Stanek calls socialist world making. As he shows, the urban architecture and material histories of the post-colonial countries cannot be understood without accounting for the exchanges with Eastern Europe and the socialist countries elsewhere. And also, one would add, visions of post-colonial independence, nation-making, and reworlding, that is his term, fueled the East European socialist imaginaries and influenced their material and symbolic environments, opening new worlds and possibilities for socialist societies in the East. These visions are embedded in the concept of Plovdiv's Bratska Mogila, both in its form and content, mobilizing local history and context in ways that are both emancipatory and global. Ordered along the walls of the circular interior are 19 sculptural compositions. With more than 40 figures, representing landmark moments in the chronicle of Bulgarian national history, from national struggles for independence, from the Ottoman Empire during the 19th century to the victory of the Socialist Revolution in 1944. As we walk around the halls of the building, the scenes reveal themselves cinematically, each of them animating key moments from the revolutionary history of the Bulgarian people. The sculptural series orchestrates an affective journey that is at once a ritual movement, an act of commemoration, and an inauguration into a historical narrative rewritten through the era of the 60s and the 70s. I will move this further down. The left side of the circle is dedicated to the struggles for national independence. Here's the legendary battle of Zhivka in the mountain of Stara Planina, and there's other scenes which I cannot focus on right now. And it ends with the scene striking workers, the birth of the working class movement, a female worker standing next to a male comrade, her arms on her chest, her head aiming high. All these are landmark historical moments, figures, and dramatic collective states of the people from the canon of national history, which cohered in the post-Stalinist period. They represent a stretch of time which births the nation's political sovereignty and independence, and they underscore links between the formation of national consciousness, the struggle for political autonomy, and the birth of the socialist and working class movement. Right of the center, the storyline continues with the scene execution, and this is the scene in its original condition. Two male partisans captured in a moment standing at gunpoint minutes before their assassination. One of the partisans is currently missing his head, which had disappeared sometime in the 90s, and I'll say more about this and the current condition of the monument, but the other one remains intact. He's facing death in dignity and power, his feet solidly anchored to the ground, his large chest and body standing like a rock, leaning his head on his shoulder. There's great complexity in this overwhelming scene of both vulnerability and strength, as the two young men are holding their hands in a tight grip for support and perhaps in gratitude that they're not alone. This composition is followed by an intense stretch of scenes capturing the anti-fascist armed resistance, as well as the persecutions, repressions, and murders of communist and anti-fascist activists and fighters, scenes of prisons, ropes, and gallows, of armed battles in the field and trenches, of carrying wounded comrades, and so on. There's also the captivating scene Yatachki, something that I can't translate right now. So I'll leave it like this. Two young women, maybe even girls, sitting down in silence and suspense, their senses tense and alert. The Yataci movement was indeed a most essential part of the anti-fascist struggle in Bulgaria. They were in the tens of thousands, including women, men, children, and the elderly. Their work and activism sustained the armed resistance against the Nazi allied government during World War II by providing for the material and logistical needs of the militants who joined the fighting cells and the brigades. The Yataci offered the logistical support and the basic means of reproduction for the organized resistance, such as food, shelter, and medical assistance. They harbored the fighters and fugitives at night, opening their homes for shelter and aided them by guiding them through secret pathways in the mountains or across the borders. We could not ignore the gender dimensions of this labor, as the stories of the Yataci are full of self-sacrifice in the name of protecting their comrades, of putting themselves at risk in order to provide safety and refuge for others, by setting aside their own needs to tend to the needs of others, and by risking their own lives to save the lives of others. It is a stark example of what we could call militant social, reproductive, and care work, which sustained the underground organized anti-fascist resistance activity prior to and during World War II, and made possible the day-to-day and long-term reproduction of the struggle. The series of sculptures in the Bratska Mogila is a chronicle of 19th and 20th century Bulgarian history from below, saturated in heroic pathos and collective dignity. Three powerful female figures provide a culmination to this post-Stalinist narrative. These are the allegorical representations of the people, the revolutionary moment, and the nation, although they could be interpreted in multiple ways, and this is the case with many compositions in the series. One of the figures is Victory, currently showing here, most likely representing the victory over fascism globally. She's a robust female figure carved in monumental and masculine volumes, seized in restless diagonal movements in a forward and upward driven motion, her fist raised in power. Her face is frozen in a raw expression of tension and fervor. Her gaze is intense and her look is frenzied. This figure is a powerful synthesis of the psychic and emotional state in the revolutionary moment, captured in the threshold where exhilaration, exhaustion, and elevation are all blurred together in perhaps a momentary madness. This is the original picture from 1974 of the scenes. There's dialectical tension in every part of this complex and the multi-dimensional ensemble that it presents, and it is found in the opposing yet complementary logics of its forms and materials. The strict angular geometry of the concrete walls is juxtaposed to the circular form of their base, and the stone and metal used in the sculptural compositions stand in contrast to each other, both in texture and in color. The figures, frozen in dramatic moments of action, come to life in dynamic compositions of diagonals and verticals, of stone and metal, which are further enlivened by the rhythmic play of light and shadow coming from the sky. The figures were first sculpted in clay. Then the clothed parts of the bodies were carved in limestone, delicately colored in warm, soft hues. And their surfaces were carefully chiseled to add texture and to soften the transitions of light and shadow on their otherwise quite dramatic angular volumes. The exposed parts of the bodies of the figures, usually their arms, hands, and feet, their heads and limbs, were cast in bronze amalgam, which, darkened with time, stands in contrast to the lightly colored trunks of the bodies. Somewhere inside, under the ground, there's a metal shell containing a message for the future generations deposited during the construction of the monument. Many people remember that this was a popular practice at the time, and indeed similar metal containers lay underneath other monuments from the socialist times, including under the granite soldier Alyosha, whose stern silhouette could be seen on the nearby hill, Granite Hill. We do not know what the message says. Made to survive the ages for an unknown future, it is perhaps meant to provide a key to the meanings and lessons of its time. In the 1970s, the remains of the partisans were relocated from their original burial sites scattered around Plovdiv and were taken to their new abode, stored in the wall of urns built in the back and center of the interior. There, over 100 urns, hand-wrought in bronze, are ordered in strict and solemn geometry. It is unclear how many of the urns contain actual remains, but we know that the Pantheon is the resting place of Liliana Dimitrova, a fearless young organizer in the working class movement and a leading figure of the communist youth worker organization called REMS before and during World War II. The youth organization, popular among workers and high school and university students, was outlawed by the authoritarian government after a military coup in 1934, yet it continued its activity underground for another decade and joined the anti-fascist resistance during World War II. Liliana, one of its leaders, took her own life in Plovdiv to protect her comrades because she was caught, surrounded, and ambushed by the police with no chance of getting out. Only 2 years earlier, she and other women had fled the political prison camp for women near Asenograd, a town nearby, to continue their organizing, but this time she knew she would not escape torture and a gruesome death. She died on June 27, 1944, at the age of 25. The place of her death, near the center of the city, is commemorated by a modest marble plate, and many also remember the monument to Liliana in the park nearby. The sculpture of Liliana is now long gone and with unclear whereabouts, but the commemorative plate remains, although in recent years it has become the target of repeated abuse and vandalism by neo-fascist formations, each time restored by the people over and again. In front of the barrier walls stands the voluminous masculine body of a male partisan in the scene 1923, the communist uprising in September from the same year, which was violently suppressed. This mighty male figure has kneeled in front of the buried, his body facing the viewer, protecting their sleep. Larger in size than most figures, he projects a monumental and intimidating presence. His architectonic body is hewn in angular volumes and in large strokes out of 3 massive blocks of limestone. His face, viewed from the low angle, is frozen in a fierce and austere expression, his gaze strong and determined, his eyes piercing deep into the night, his large angular jaws closed in a tight grip, his hands clenched in massive fists. Most likely he is standing there like a guard on duty, a night guard protecting their sleep. During the socialist period, the figure of the guard in the anti-fascist resistance was recreated in multiple ways. Poems and artworks were created to highlight the political contributions of those who took turns to protect their comrades, and the official culture of ritual commemoration gave the figure of the guard a special place. The keeper stands in front of the walls of the buried partisans day and night, watching over the resting abodes of his comrades. Nowadays, when the fate of the monument is uncertain and in danger, when it continues to be a target of attacks with anti-communist and fascist content at night, this particular meaning could not be more relevant. He is there when no one else is, to protect them, to shield them from danger or harm in their permanent sleep. During the daytime, the Bratska Mogila is in good hands under the watchful eye of a day guard. Actually, he just retired. His name was Nedelchev. He was looking after the site with dignity and care for about 2 decades now, and I just want to show him and to sort of celebrate his contribution to protecting the museum and the site. Originally a municipal property, currently the Bratska Mogila is under the custody of the Regional History Museum, which has secured its minimal protection and maintenance. The municipality has exploited the site for various projects, which have occasionally generated revenue, but the anti-communist city government, dominated by right-wing nationalist and new liberal political parties for years, has been unwilling to allocate any resources for the reconstruction of this totalitarian and communist era government. Back in the 90s, the monument was broken into and was left gaping open, abandoned to the mercy of the people during the tumultuous economic and political times of the early transition. It was a decade of economic crisis and political turmoil when Bulgarian society lived through hyperinflation and the severe social effects caused by radical privatization and price deregulation. During this decade, people took apart the bronze elements of the sculptures and reused them for their recyclable value. They removed much of the metal, such as the limbs and heads of the figures, leaving their massive bodies awkwardly decapitated and painfully dismembered. The doors to the Mogila were secured later, and currently there is limited access to the interior of the monument. During the daytime, the open public space around the monument and its adjacent forested park serves as a lovely outdoor space for the neighborhood and the city. The tomb opens on September 9 and May 9, when citizens have an opportunity to lay flowers and pay homage to the fallen anti-fascists. After dark, however, the building is left unattended, and their interactive and accessible surfaces of the outer walls of the buildings have become a platform for expression of various subcultures of teenage creativity and anonymous speech sprayed in graffiti or stencils. Every so often, love messages appear on the steep inclines of the walls, some scribbled in tiny letters and hidden in the folds, others sharing their confessions loudly so that they can be seen from afar. Much too often, the Bratska Mogila has become the target of neo-fascist and extreme right-wing nationalist attacks, and its surfaces are often being defaced with fascist symbols and hate speech towards sexual, religious, and ethnic and racial minorities. That these messages appear on the Bratska Mogila is not a coincidence. They are premeditating political attacks targeting the stronghold of the anti-fascist spirit and struggle with dreadful and illegal content. The city routinely ignores the issue, and local and state authorities have willfully neglected or refused to investigate the hate crimes, practically becoming complicit in the propagation of fascist content and hate toward ethnic, religious, and sexual minorities on municipal property. Yet all the damage, abuse, and neglect that the monument has suffered throughout the years, all the graffiti and litter that have perpetually covered it in the last 30 years, and the regular political assault by new fascists and nationalists cannot suppress the wondrous otherworldliness of the place and the sacred and spiritual energy it summons. There, the spirit of the warriors and their work remains, surpassing the nationalist framework that they're cast in, as well as the anti-communist currents of the day. Where to put this on? Okay. The leading artist of the sculptural series is the renowned sculptor Lyubomir Dalchev. The artist created the sculptural sequence together with his younger colleagues Anna Dalcheva and Petr Atanasov in close collaboration with the architects of the structure. Dalchev himself has a peculiar life journey. He was born in 1902 in Thessaloniki, which was part of the Ottoman Empire at the time. He lived for nearly 100 years through a stretch of unfathomable historical changes that spanned the entire 20th century, and his experience included a one-way journey across the Atlantic Ocean to the United States. Leaving socialist Bulgaria as a political refugee at the age of 77, he fled for the United States in 1979 and eventually settled in California. Dalchev left a giant presence in the history of monumental sculpture in Bulgaria for 3 entire decades from the 1950s until the end of the 70s. His contemporaries remember him as an eccentric figure with a strong sense of autonomy. He was among the first generation of artists to break away from the descriptive and narrative style and the naturalism of socialist realism in Bulgarian sculpture. He played a vivid role in shaping the aesthetics of socialist modernism in the public monumental arts. During the socialist years, Dauchev was often accused of falling into formalism, abstraction, and for channeling Western influences. His contemporaries recount that his sculptures were becoming larger and larger in size, more voluminous in form, and more expressive by the day, which aggravated the establishment but yielded admiration and respect from the professional communities. His mature monumental works reached remarkable levels of synthesis of form, content, and environment. In these later works, he often used symbolism and allegory, which added to the poetic effect and the dramatic power of his works. Dauchev's style could not be mistaken. Both in form and content, his works pushed the limits of representation through an expressive stylization of his figures, which appeared in massive generalized volumes. His characters are always animated and arrested in a moment of tension, in a dramatic state of movement or internal drama expressed in three-dimensional form. His figures are often diagonally mobilized, lengthened or distended by some larger energetic forces, their bodies both captives and agents of some larger historical and political process. And this is a sculpture called Africa from the 1970s, from a recent exhibition, retrospective, organized in the City Gallery of Sofia. And these are the sketches, the preparatory sketches for the Bratska Mogila, which were generously provided to me by the Sofia City Gallery, and I'm using the opportunity to show them here. Only some of the sketches that I can show. Petr Atanasov, one of the co-founders of the co-authors of the sequence inside the Bratska Mogila, and Dauchev's former student, recounts that the artist often complained about the thematic limitations of his commissioned works. Enough with their uprisings and strikes, insurgencies, revolts, and scenes of struggles, of wounded partisans and soldiers, enough with their victories and liberations. But this thematic range was in fact the perfect stage for Dauchev and the human drama that unfolded in his art. This drama, Atanasov writes, was the central problem and the focus in his work, and it always took a central stage. Indeed, his figures capture states of suffering, of grief, of frenzy, and of agitation in a way that is emotionally and physically embodied, reflecting in Atanasov's work political and social turmoil through deep personal psychology. Dauchev's contemporaries recount that the party leadership intentionally minimized the artist's influence on the contemporary visual arts. Perhaps out of fear of his colossal influence and his powerful style, they assigned to him only marginal roles in the cultural administration. But he was in fact given awards in a wide terrain for shaping the monumental arts, winning major competitions and receiving massive and ambitious public art commissions all over the country. And this is one of the monuments from the 70s in Peruštica, where these high reliefs are Dauchev's work. During the period in Bulgaria, he created over 230 sculptural works, many of them large and monumental works in public space, part of the architectural and sculptural ensembles that characterize the public monumental arts. He also trained an entire generation of sculptors active in the 70s and the 80s. And this is a work by one of his students, Krum Demjanov, and a team of architects and sculptors. In other words, he was a rather uncomfortable figure, yet his creative vision, his authority, talent, and experience remained unmatched and elicited great respect and admiration in the professional communities. This is why his departure for the United States made a statement that caused quite a stir among the political and cultural elites in the country. Witnesses recall that upon learning about his move, the government and the party tried to persuade him to return, but he was relentless and never looked back. He lived in California for the rest of his life and departed from this world in 2002, reaching almost his 100th year on this earth. At the age of 77, he was able to establish his art practice anew, adapting somehow to the unrelenting conditions of American life. There he had received several public commissions, but none of them matched the power, scope, and monumental force of the works he had left behind in socialist Bulgaria. The narrative content of Plovdiv's Bratska Mogila was a temple for the fallen heroes of the socialist and anti-fascist movements. And as such, it was supposed to be focused primarily on anti-fascist partisan history. But during a discussion, it was proposed that the narrative be broadened to include the struggle for national independence against capitalism and generally to be unified under the theme liberation. Dauchev, who never identified as a communist and never joined the party, welcomed with enthusiasm this broader theme. The truth is that he always gravitated towards themes from the repertoire of national history with a nationalist bent, and his work was central to crafting the heroic visuality of the national canon as it was rewritten during the 60s and 70s. Plovdiv's Bratska Mogila exemplifies this novel articulation of national history in a post-Stalinist context, forging continuities between the national anti-capitalist and anti-fascist struggles. This was the revolutionary history of the people, a history from below, which required a thorough rewriting of the national idea through a socialist and anti-fascist lens. National history, in order to be a socialist history, had to be rewritten as a people's history and a revolutionary history, one grounded in the stories of oppression and collective struggle. Calling itself socialist patriotism, post-Stalinist nationalism changed the national narrative to purge it of its bourgeois content and its historical links to interwar nationalist movements. Further, the rise of post-Stalinist nationalism emerged as a kind of cultural emancipation from Soviet hegemony. In some sense, nationalist discourse from the period was embedded in a politics of resistance, both against Stalinism and against Soviet cultural and political influence. It gave post-Stalinist humanists the opportunity to display Soviet-centric histories of the socialist revolution as a world historical phenomenon and to trace an internal genealogy of revolutionary traditions in the struggles of its own people. It staged a competing revolutionary narrative that decentered the February and October revolutions. After all, the Bulgarian people have their own revolutionary traditions. As I show in my book, this commitment to national and patriotic ideas, dressed in socialist and humanist spirit, opened the terrains for the ethnic assimilation campaigns rooted in developmentalist, ethnocentric, and anti-Muslim sentiments. The ethnic assimilation campaigns were developed in the context of a socialist modernization project built on humanist foundations and from within a kind of progressive Marxist humanist discourse. At the same time, the international context in the 60s and 70s changed socialist Bulgaria's orientation in the global sphere, and so Bulgarian revolutionary history had to be rethought in a new global context in relation to ongoing anti-colonial, anti-racist, and anti-capitalist struggles in Africa and North America, and in the context of the ongoing wars in Vietnam. Bulgarian political discourse during the period, anchored in the narrative of centuries-long oppression under Ottoman rule, constructed a shared historical experience with the people of the colonized world, thereby opening possibilities for various forms of political self-identification and symbolic links with the colonized people and their own national liberation movements. This is particularly legible in the work of Lyudmila Zhivkova, a leading figure who shaped the cultural politics of the country in the 1970s. Her writings contain belief in universalism and evolutionary progress, and a certain kind of awareness of the Bulgarian people as a minor nation and a minor people. Zhivkova's work is in the sphere of culture was crucial to reimagining and reconfiguring the small socialist country in alliance with the countries from the global south and in exploring links with non-Western cultural histories and traditions. Historian Teodora Dragostinova in her book shows that in this context, the socialist government used culture and cultural diplomacy to elevate the visibility and the recognition of the country in the global sphere, while forging politics with anti-colonial and anti-imperialist content. Terms such as robstvo or ego, slavery or yoke, forcefully reappeared in literary, cinematic, and scholarly reconstructions of the Ottoman period from the post-Stalinist years. And this is one scene from the Bratska Mogila called Yoke, Robstvo. These terms draw on the historical and literary narratives from the 18th and 19th centuries, which played a central role in shaping Bulgarian national consciousness. This language gained new meaning in the 60s and 70s as the stories, news, and voices of the anti-colonial liberation struggles echoed in the Bulgarian newspapers. The visual and monumental arts from the period also mobilized these analogies. A striking example of this is the opening scene of the sculptural sequence in Plovdiv, Robstvo, that is currently on view. An allegory of oppression and freedom, the scene resembles the shackles of the Bulgarian people during the Ottoman period. In it, a multitude of male arms in metal chains is reaching for the skies, and meanwhile, next to them, a lone and slender female figure is leaning in prayer and desperation over a crib and a baby. There are obviously some sort of gender stereotypes that kind of perhaps reveal, perhaps unbeknownst to its authors, the kind of the patriarchal logics that are involved in the construction of this nationalist narrative of oppression. But I will return to the architecture of the Bratska Mogila, which also contains decolonial and subaltern elements, although different. And so this circular shape of the architectural design was meant to resemble a Thracian dolmen or a mound. And the dolmens and the mounds were the ancient abodes of the Thracian people. And the architect recounts that that his main goal was to establish the spiritual and the material connection to our historical past. This is one of the dolmens or the mounds in Bulgaria. The interest in Thracian heritage during the 60s and 70s in Bulgaria exploded when the discipline Trachologia was expanded with a newly founded Center for Thracian Studies. Many of the mogilas were excavated as part of the state's ambitious archaeological excavation campaigns developed under Lyudmila Zhivka's cultural policy. The Thracian presented with ambiguous origins and did not neatly lend themselves to a study via cultural analogies. They were in close but complex historical and political relations with ancient Greece and the foreign others of their political order. Their cultural forms were amalgamous and cultic in quotes, mainly reproduced through oral and musical traditions, through performance and rituals, and could not be neatly dated or ordered according to existing Greco-Roman and Eurocentric canons. This increased interest in the Thracian culture and history in the 70s was part of the nationalist trend of the politics from the period. It aimed to ground the young socialist nation in a reinvented ancient past, drawing a cultural lineage to an original antiquity, often making exaggerated claims and reaching quite absurd conclusions. And historian Chavdar Marinov has written about this very eloquently. At the same time, this trend was also part of the emancipatory politics and poetics of Bulgarian post-Stalinism in a global context. Constructing a cultural continuity with the Thracian architectural and cultural heritage was a way of refusing the subsumption of Bulgarian ancient history into the margins of Greco-Roman and European ancient history. It emancipated local ancient history from the canon of European antiquity, to which it would have always belonged in a provincial and marginal way. And in conclusion, or instead of conclusion, These nationalist imaginaries reverberated across the continents in the socialist and post-colonial worlds, intertwined in their own ways. Post-colonial critics of the nation have spoken out about the pitfalls and paradoxes of national consciousness as they organized the anti-colonial imaginaries during the period of decolonization, of the dead ends and disastrous political consequences of the nation state, both as an anti-colonial vision of political sovereignty and as a political and social organization of post-colonial societies. Through the nation form, post-colonial societies replicated the cultural and political imaginaries of the colonizers, which were utterly unsuited to the social and cultural realities of societies in the former colonies. Post-colonial countries too experienced the violence of homogenization and erasure, of ethnic and religious partitioning, while constructing their national cultures and histories, all in the name of independence, modernization, social justice, and democracy, similar to what the Balkans went through throughout the early 20th century and longer. And as a final note, I want to kind of highlight the monument's complexity, returning to the Bratska Mogila without over-determining its meaning. On the one hand, it contains subaltern elements which played a crucial role in repositioning socialist Bulgaria in political solidarity with the newly independent nations of the global south, and in shaping the socialist people's political identification with the people in the post-colonial countries. On the other hand, humanist universalism opened the road to monistic visions of peoplehood and a monistic narrative of the nation. These contradictions are present in the structure and meaning of the monument in every possible way. In the meeting points where global socialist world making meets local history and its emancipatory visions, in the contrast between the rational geometry of its forms and its rather spiritual effects, in the collapse of linearity of past, present, and the future, all these being part of a socialist modernity with spiritual and planetary elements where new geographies and temporalities emerged. Thank you. And now I will stop.
Okay, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. We will now give a floor to Prof. Mani, who will have more extensive engagements with you.
Thank you very much for this interesting conversation. I want to begin by sort of telling an anecdote, which I think captures the connection between post-colonial Africa and socialist Bulgaria. When I was a student at the University of Ghana in the 80s, and I was trying to get back to Zimbabwe, it was cheaper to fly from Kotoka Airport in Accra, Ghana, to go to with Bulgarian Airways to go to Sofia, and then from there, catch another Bulgarian Airways flight from there into Harare, than to fly from Accra into Addis Ababa into Harare. So the point I'm just sort of trying to make is that even in terms of the way the transport system was set up during those eras, there was this complex entanglement between socialist Bulgaria in this case, and post-colonial Africa or African countries that were just emerging from colonial rule. Was the Bulgarian Airlines used to serve more or less as a facilitator for inter-African communication. But then the paradox was that you had to go to Bulgaria in order to cross the African continent. Okay, now this leads me to my next question. One of the key themes that you raised, which I found very interesting, was that there was evidence of the impact of Bulgarian architecture or in cities like Lagos. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? What
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt, and yes, and thank you for these very interesting observations and for opening the conversation. And so there's a tremendous scholarship on now, and that's actually quite recent, and about architectural influences and kind of interactions between African and mutual imbrications between African and East European architectures. And Lukac Stanek and Zoltan Ginelli also have contributed to this work. And so yes, and I think that it is part of these exchanges from the 1960s and the 1970s that were organized, that were these collaborations that were organized by the African countries, newly independent nations and post-colonial countries, and the socialist governments. And that was part of the exchange of labor, exchange of expertise, exchange of specialized labor, such as engineers and different kinds of specialists. There were various exchange programs that were very important for shaping the cultures and the material environments of both the African countries and the socialist East European countries. And so, you know, our effort has been really to recover these collaborations that were so important for kind of forging the kind of these non-Western modernities that emerged in the post-colonial world, as well as, you know, these urban environments, these like the cities, the shape of the cities, and the modernist visions that were non-Western. Bojan Videkanic has called it non-aligned modernisms. You know, the contributions of Yugoslav architects and engineers. And so, and also vice versa. I mean, recently there has been very interesting work on the Soviet Union, for example, and the kind of the exchanges in the Soviet Union between African scholars and cultural producers and filmmakers. And for example, the Tashkent Film Festival in Tashkent, which where a lot of African filmmakers could kind of gathered and to meet fellow filmmakers and intellectuals from all over Africa and the global South. And so these were kind of alternative routes where these kind of convergences were taking place on the terrains of you know, the former socialist world, and on the terrains of the post-colonial countries that were about shaping these kind of alternative visions of independence, of modernity, that were anti-capitalist. They were also kind of informed by anti-colonial politics. And so yes, thank you so much.
Thank you. I think, let me try and look into the future, given what you are saying, and then I can try and imagine the nature of the scholarship that in another world I might be interested in seeing develop as an extension of what you are talking about. The scholarship that I might be interested in seeing develop, which emerges organically from what you are talking about, would be, I think, possibly taking place, and I might not be familiar with it, is one where it would be interesting to see how Bulgarian scholars make use, let's say, of African scholarship, let's say the works of people like Achim Bembe, Mahmoud Mamdani, etc., you know, in their own political context. That would really be quite interesting. And then the reverse would be interesting. You try and have or train or develop a cadre of African scholars who are also fairly well attuned to the nature of scholarship in Eastern Europe. And then they could see how that Eastern European scholarship might be relevant to their own work. In other words, what I think we're trying to do here, as my friend Cecil Veguru would put it, is try and see how we can establish a dialogue between people who are interested in the same thing, but they hardly talk to each other or are not deeply familiar with each other's work. So, for example, if there is, like you're saying, the impact of Bulgarian, let's say, architecture on Lagos and African school architecture on Bulgaria, surely it would be useful also at a level of ideas to see how we can build that interconnection. Right. So that if you're dealing with African studies, it'd be interesting to see African studies, how is that, what do they study in Bulgaria? And what would be the role of, let's say, in African studies, you build Eastern Europe into African studies, so that your efforts to decenter, let's say, the global north will involve shifting to other geographical regions as well. Right. I mean, these are just my own rambling thoughts. So, in other words, what we need, like you're talking about, is building a group of students who are familiar with the different traditions of scholarship in Eastern Europe and in Africa, and then they can come up with another alternative imaginary of what that scholarship would look like. How does that sound like an idea?
Fantastic idea. Fantastic. Anyone wants to add to this? Because yes, absolutely. This is kind of, I mean, it's very important to shift these methodologies to kind of further decenter and away from Western historiographies by tracing these, and they were very robust and important in the 70s, but like now completely marginalized and forgotten now by these kind of historiographies that focus mostly on the North-South relations or East-West relations. And so the relations between the South and the East is incredibly important in that they were, you know, the non-aligned movement, they were kind of these different, you know, the incredibly important and powerful, forceful sort of international networks that were forged. And so, for example, the Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow, that also in Bulgaria, in Socialist Bulgaria, that brought a lot of students from the African countries in, and there's also been scholarship by Maxim Matusevich, who has written precisely on, he's focused on the Patrice Lumumba University and African students and the impact of African students, the influence of African students and African culture in the Soviet Union in the 1970s. And so, you know, it's very important to trace this, like how influential that was, people from the newly independent post-colonial nations for the socialist countries. And so, because, you know, what African students in particular, you know, were very, when they arrived in the socialist countries in the 60s and the 70s, I mean, they were very rebellious, and they taught the socialist youth about how to rebel, how to, you know, about resistance. They taught the socialist people about resistance, and they also taught them about racism and anti-racism. And, you know, they generated these cultures of non-conformity, and so they inspired various forms of social protest. And there were a number of these kinds of things that we have in Bulgaria. For example, the Youth Festival in 1968 is very important because it brought all the people from it's incredible, from it was dedicated to Vietnam, and then and kind of in solidarity with the people fighting against imperialism in Vietnam. And so it had this kind of anti-imperialist content in the first place, and it brought people from Africa, from South Asia, Vietnam, from a lot of places, and very few people, some people from Eastern Europe, people also from the Western countries, Black African American people from the United States were also part of this kind of global visions, and their struggles, the struggles of African American people against racism in the United States. And so these were kind of these alliances that were global political and alliances, solidarities that had this kind of anti-racist, anti-colonial visions. And so I absolutely agree with you that, you know, we need to expand this tremendously important work of tracing historically what happened in the 60s and the 70s in the first place, and see how there was kind of these mutual influences, these and these kind of alternative globalities.
Yes, yes. Because what these alternative globalities mean for us is that it is indeed possible to change the world in some ways. For example, if you follow these African students and the impact they had when engaging with Bulgaria, when they were in a minority in a foreign place, and the impact that they had, means that if that could happen and if that could be carried out by students in Bulgaria, it is indeed possible. It may provide a useful analytical template to what in actual fact is intellectually possible even up till now, so that you don't then over-exaggerate the strength and power of the global north to determine and dictate the terms of scholarship in the south and in the east. Yeah. That's my own view. Let me give over to Mfundo because there are a number of questions in the chat box. Thanks a lot. Mfundo.
Yes. So unfortunately, at this point in time, we only have comments on the chat
No,
box.
that's fine. That's fine.
I just wanted to ask, following the discussion between Makomi and Zhivka, do you have Zhivka, do you have any recommendation of books that were written on these African student migrations to the Soviet Union that we could
Absolutely.
that were written?
Definitely.
Sorry, I only read English mainly or French, but something that a broader international audience could read. Do you mind putting the titles in the chat? I mean, when you have time, not now, but I would be. I think that would really enrich, you know, our discussion. Thank you.
I would love that. And just very briefly to answer to Cecile, I would love to share the literature by East European and scholars focused on Soviet Union, socialist countries, kind of globally from a global perspective. And we've been just really very, very deeply involved by post and decolonial frameworks, deeply involved by and looking at what African scholars have been working on, and so I would love to share. Anyone who has suggestions, please put them. And I will. I recommend fully recommend the work of Ralph who works on cinematic, you know, the cinema and literature in these kind of sort of south to east international exchanges, the cinema and literature, and in particular, you know, he makes a really important point about the fact that a lot of students from the African countries which were not wealthy, they went to the Soviet Union to get their education. And so the Soviet Union provided stipends, they paid for their travel and provided housing, provided everything so that a lot of students could get their education in the Soviet Union and in the former socialist countries. And so for example, in contrast to, for example, Membe or you know, Fanon or people who went to the Western metropoles, who are from more, you know, who kind of went to more were educated in Paris or in London or in other in the West, you know, the socialist countries educated people that were more from kind of more modest backgrounds, and you know, and they created, for example, Sembene. There's a lot of social sort of like incredibly powerful social sort of cultural producers, like with social content, social critique, like you know, a lot of filmmakers, African film, for example, was you know, people got their training in filmmaking in the Soviet Union, and so like Rosenjagov treats that theme with great precision and detail, and it's extremely interesting. I was you know, I learned so much from his work, and so many others. There's here's the title of Rosenjagov, and many others I'm happy to share.
Okay.
Okay. We have a question from Dr. Busimakone. Dr. Busimakone, the floor is yours.
My question really is on the gender dynamics in this context you are studying. Earlier in your presentation, we see, you know, women emerging, well, significantly not, well, less than men, but significantly doing better. And in one instance, we see a sculpture of a woman, one with a very powerful raised fist. But later on, we also see patriarchal logics in full swing. We actually even commented on that. To me, this was rather confusing, as it raised the question of whether there has been a shift in gender dynamics from the time of the resistance movement. If so, what is the current state of play insofar as gender relations are concerned?
Thank you for this beautiful question. It's like a beautiful and complex and really well formulated question, because it precisely captures kind of the contradictions and the complexity. And so on the one hand, we have these really, really powerful representations of women. I mean, the victor is a woman in this, you know, also the liberation is also a woman, victory is a woman. I mean, these are like very powerful kind of symbolic representations of the people, of freedom of the nation, and so on. And so that is very much present there. And I think it's a very conscious effort on the part of the sculptors to kind of bring out this you know, this element of women's participation and power. You know, women's participation in the resistance were, and you know, sort of composition, but yes, you see and it poses a very, very important question about gender dynamics and what gender, how was gender reconfigured during the socialist period, and which is very complex, and it's not to say completely eradicate patriarchy, which was present in other ways in monument, in kind of these visual presentations of the nation, but it is to say that there are incredible sort of gains and incredible struggle in the socialist countries that bettered the conditions for women in tremendous ways, in ways that are perhaps unparalleled in socialist Bulgaria, in terms of providing education for women, providing and also having sort of you know, achieving gender equality at the workplace, getting women to you know, to participate in public life and in international politics and so on. And so women were absolutely a very important collective force in shaping socialism and socialist politics. And another way that socialist societies kind of contributed to bettering, you know, and to gender equality basically was to kind of focus on social reproductive needs that, you know, such as childcare, kindergartens, you know, these kind of collectivizing childcare and the social reproductive needs, and the socialist countries had these very extensive systems that covered kind of childcare and other parts where, you know, that could kind of enable women to, you know, to be active participants in public life and you know, in social life. And so that, having said that, there's also patriarchal logics that, and I see that, and that, you know, it's it created its own kind of weird, sort of very specific, you know, specific field of gender relations that is kind of, you know, that we need to look at historically, and we need to look at in that particular context and study in that particular context how the patriarchy, you know, patriarchal sort of forms shifted and reproduced themselves in various ways. Of course, you know, it cannot be kind of abolished overnight, and so it's very complex question that, and thank you for, you know, picking up on that and for just really posing it here.
Okay, thank you for your comprehensive response, Zhivka. Ashraf, you can jump in.
Thank you very much for the useful presentation. I need to ask a very simple question. You, in one of the photos, you made a passing reference to the Great Mosque in Tunisia. I missed the point, actually. I couldn't relate. What's the relationship between that mosque and socialist modernism? Bearing in mind that that mosque was established in my mind before even the emergence of Western modernity. That's what, but that mosque was the oldest mosque in North Africa. Thank you.
Very good question. Thank you so much. And, you know, I really need to look into this question more, but I showed it because it's one of the oldest mosques in the continent, basically. And when Shinkov, the architect, Lyubomir Shinkov, went to Kairouan, he worked in Kairouan in Tunisia for maybe 4 or 5 years, and he was assigned, as I said, like many different tasks, large-scale projects, and one of them was the restoration of the mosque in Kairouan, and the restoration, and he designed and he kind of oversaw the restoration of the mosque, and he writes about it, you know, the way he had to kind of, you know, do this very responsible work of restoring the mosque. I don't really know much about it more than this, but it would be a very interesting question to look into further.
Okay, so at this point we don't have any questions. So what I'll do, I'll just go to the chat box and read some of the comments made by the attendees. So we have one of the comments from Vishna, which reads as follows. I completely agree with the observation that there is something which culturally connects those peoples who were under the Ottoman Empire. For example, the Belgrade in Serbia was under the Ottoman Empire, but the other parts of the country, for example, Novi Sad, were not. The cultural differences is clear. As someone who grew up mostly in the United States, I have mostly observed this through visiting Belgrade, but I find their histories fascinating. And then we have another comment from Christine Severo. So she says, I met some colleague in Angola who wrote their dissertation in the Soviet Union. This intellectual engagement also influenced the critical thinking of the liberation struggles in the country. So it was actually referring to, I was actually giving more information on the article that was posted by Vishnu. Okay, that's fine. So at this point, we don't have any questions, so I don't see.
Fundo, I can jump in though.
Yes, okay, sure.
So I was really interested in this like recent conversation about gender disparity and under socialism, because I think it's really prominent. I wrote a little bit in the chat as well. I think it's prominent in Serbia to point out like the media's portrayal of female athletes, where like I remember during the Olympics, one of my friends on Facebook was complaining about how the US media, this was maybe like 7-8 years ago, how the US media would portray female athletes with like, you know, it's a picture of them with their husband and then highlighting like the husband's accomplishments. Whereas in Serbia, you know, you would have, I think there were like, I wish I could find the picture right now. I wasn't able to find it, but you'd have like the female basketball athletes, another female athlete, and then one male athlete, like, and just captions all highlighting like the athlete's actual accomplishments. And I think this kind of focus on women's accomplishments comes from the socialist era, where, as you mentioned, the focus on women in the workplace, the advancement in sports, the workplace, and just many examples, right? Where it's really a mixed bag, where it's not clear cut of saying, okay, the hierarchies are completely gone, but a lot of advancements have been made that I think in the Western world are hard to grasp. And I think this is just one prominent example of this. Yeah. So,
okay. We currently do not have any questions. So if you
I mean, we can turn it into a conversation. I'm sure there was so many comments, and people, you know, can jump in and share their thoughts, and it doesn't have to be questions, just kind of comments and responses.
Yeah. Desmond.
Hi, thank you for this insightful presentation. As I listened to this, and especially the socialist, activities that were more out on the streets than in academic scholarship, and of course the Africa connections, I am taken back to when I was in high school in the 90s, and how universities, so I grew up in Nigeria, and universities, I live very close to the University of Nigeria. The students there often went on strike, and I know in that particular instant, it was in response to the World Bank's structural adjustment programs, which shifted tuition to students, and they were up in protests. But I think that was a continuation of what I thought were protest movements even before then. Now, when I think of the ways that young people responded then, in terms of social activism, in terms of protest against oppressive regimes and so forth, and then think of the ways that has played out now, I wonder if we still have that culture of protest today. And while you were presenting, I was wondering to what extent getting people to be a bit more aware of that history can inform people's exercise of their agency today, especially in experiencing oppressive political regimes. Some of you might be aware that recently there was this End SARS movement in Nigeria that ended in a bloody response from the government. But I don't think this is anything new. So I wonder if we are at a time when, on one hand, people have come to recognize that the institutions of the nation state, or broadly that capitalist modernity would exercise whatever violence it can avail itself to calm any protest on one hand, or maybe younger people are no longer aware of the sacrifices made by others in the past that resulted in some of the gains that I think were even recorded, and whether learning about those can make any difference. So perhaps more open-ended, more activist-oriented question, but I just wonder the value of this conversation for the activism part of it.
Fantastic question, and also, I mean, yeah, I'd really be interested to see what other people kind of think and what they can contribute to this. But the way I'm kind of thinking about it is, it's a very important question, because for me it has to do with kind of the legacy of the socialist past and how we look at it, and the way, for example, in Eastern Europe and in Bulgaria in particular, but other parts of Eastern Europe where, you know, where we had the former socialist governments that, you know, and the former the socialist past that kind of is seen as a failure. Usually it was, you know, the kind of the absolute complete triumph of capitalism, and, you know, this neoliberal radical restructuring of society, of the economy, and, you know, and everything you could think of, like radical privatization, radical price deregulation, and so all of that was like kind of the dismantling of the socialist what the socialist governments have achieved, and all of their material environments, that even the built material environment was dismantled through privatization, public sector completely privatized, buildings formerly state-owned and municipal buildings completely sold and privatized for so that, like, that devaluation of the material culture, of the infrastructure, and also the devaluation of the socialist experiment in general, which I think was true, like really radical for its time. And we have to really look back and rethink and reopen and rethink that time, instead of kind of castigating it as something that is failed and something that, you know, was useless, and calling it totalitarianism and so on. And there was so much more going on in terms of radical politics and so on. And so I think, for, you know, just kind of reflecting on your question and being and thinking about our own experience, and but also how that affected kind of global politics, the fall of the socialist governments in Eastern Europe affected global politics in very negative ways. In that, you know, socialisms were proclaimed failures, they were dead, and so on. And so that really kind of legitimated a certain kind of neoliberalism and deepened it. And so I think that, you know, we as scholars and also activists, thinking about how we have to reclaim that past in ways that are, you know, and reopen their potentials, their, you know, and the beautiful things that happened there that we have lost, and we have radically, you know, lost, and in the last 30 years in Bulgaria, that is, you know, that is seen, you know, 30 years of post-socialist development has been a complete and absolute disaster, in terms of producing very quickly emerging these vast inequalities, really run down and falling public infrastructure that is absolutely in, you know, completely falling apart, public institutions, hospitals, healthcare, schools. I mean, it's in complete ruination. And so, you know, and so I think that, you know, when it comes to mobilizing, you know, protest, mobilizing, that in particular in our context, it has to do with, like, kind of also mobilizing the past differently, and really rethinking it in positive ways.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I think let me just jump in and ask somebody who has been very active in the chat. Zoltan, what's your view about how this conversation has been going on? Because I've seen that you've made some comments in the chat box, and you're very familiar with the geographical, with the region from which the speaker is talking. What's your view about all this?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
just can't see myself. I do agree in general what Zhivka said about how to reinterpret our socialist history here in Eastern Europe, and also that this is part of a global story, and how it should be seen as part of, socialist world making, or socialist, what it was called as socialist internationalism. Although I do think that the fact that this neoliberal purge resulted in this, very, very neo-fascistic anti-communism, sort of resulted also in this post-socialist amnesia of forgetting this past and what this socialist internationalism gave us, or how it globalized radically the economies, and also made some of these relations, foreign relations and diplomatic relations, about anti-racism and anti-colonialism, and it was a radical shift. But despite all this, I also think that many leftists from the region who consider themselves as radical, anti-capitalists and have activist work, also have a rosy view about the actual motivations of these socialist economies, which I try to show in my work. And we also have an upcoming chapter with James Mark and others about travel writing, and how this anti-coloniality during the socialist period also contained colonial frameworks and a lot of inherited coloniality. And this also connects to the fact that despite this anti-racist, ideology, that was pretty much motivated by opening up to other dependent economies in the Afro-Asian region, to lever dependency, which came from the West, but actually it kind of died out immediately as the structural conditions changed by the end of the 70s. So we have to understand that against this rosy illusion of, this very, we'd like to believe that this was actually something very radical, but it was motivated by very deep structural conditions and dependencies. And this is not a critique on the socialist utopia ideas about socialist liberation and the socialist state of solidarity, but this is actually about understanding this past in order to understand what's going on right now, because there are marked continuities, at least in Hungary. If you look at how Viktor Orban is trying to, re-centralize the state, and how you have to have this kind of state control in semi-peripheral economies because of these dependencies. So, although I agree in many things, I think I might be a bit more pessimistic when it comes to these actual anti-colonial and anti-racial solidarities that were in this actually quite, I wouldn't say totalitarian, of course, but quite authoritative or authoritarian system, which of course wasn't a homogeneous period and past. We must not forget that. So it changed a lot in 4 decades.
Thank you, Sultan.
Thanks a lot. Let me invite, is it Fega Moses, because I've seen that in the chat, he's also making quite a lot of comments. Do you want to jump in to let us know what you think? Is Fega Moses still around, or not? Okay. Right. Okay.
Hello, Prof.
Yes, jump in, but I saw you with some comments, so I wanted us to get a sense of what your views were.
Yeah, actually, I'm trailing behind all the discussions because since I started joining the meeting, Of course, I'm following the discussions, but at the same time, I'm floating. Because,
Okay.
I didn't have the orientation as to, regards the, all the discussions. But
Mhm.
what I made the comment on has to do with, one of the comments someone made about the use of second and third
Yes.
word. So I'm
Mhm.
saying actually the usage of those two terms for me is not a problem, but the rationale and the mentality behind, when you are using it, what exactly, you're driving at. Such that if you say the two words should be abolished,
Mhm.
but maybe what people do is still indicating, that idea. Okay. So that's what I was trying to, to comment
You
on
get it.
when I saw it on the
Okay.
platform.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Thanks. Okay. Unyere, do you have anything to say? And Vicky, anybody can jump in. They should feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I have a question. But first of all, thank you for the presentation. It was interesting. You said something about exchanges between Bulgaria and generally Eastern European countries with African countries. And I guess my question is, what exactly did African countries exchange with Bulgaria and other Eastern European countries, apart from maybe resources? I don't know, because growing up in Nigeria, I was aware of many Nigerian students who were given scholarships to go study in different, Eastern European countries, including Russia. I have a few members of my family who benefited from that. And maybe in the area of politics, I also see some influence. And in construction, again, growing up in Nigeria, there were some Eastern European countries that were involved in constructing roads and bridges and certain buildings and so on. But I don't know exactly what they got from Africa, that is the Eastern European countries got from Africa, apart from maybe resources and I don't know, maybe a few other things. I think the exchange was more one way than two ways from my own observations and experiences. So could you sort of let us know what kinds of influences Africa may have had on these Eastern European countries? In other words, if we went to Bulgaria, Romania, and other places, what would be the exact African influences that we see there? And I'm not talking about the presence of, African people there.
Beautiful. This is a very complex question. It kind of really, maybe Zoltan will also have a way to respond to that. But it really gets to the kind of the central core of some questions in terms of also methodologies in thinking about this, because I think that kind of there has been kind of like, usually it's been thought in this kind of one way, that for example, countries from Africa were these passive recipients of aid and expertise or education or something like that. But and they were, of course, kind of, especially in the context of former Yugoslavia, there were these kind of developmentalist frameworks that were very much present in the sort of in the planning of these international sort of programs. Developmentalist frameworks were very much present and in the socialist kind of planning, and that was projected onto African countries. But also it would be, and I think it's very much the case in the former Yugoslavia, also in the Soviet Union, there has been some sort of some of that, but also it's very important to kind of recognize that this was not exactly one way, and that, for example, the socialist countries needed and wanted to forge these kinds of global international sort of connections that were not, it was part of kind of this global anti-hegemonic effort of sort of building global resistance to Western capitalism. And so how do we think about, these this connection not only in unidirectional ways, but also, for example, if you go to Plovdiv, which is where I grew up in Bulgaria, you see a collection of Mexican art, for example, which an extensive collection of Mexican art, and so it's kind of a permanent exposition, and so also my colleague Bojana Videkanic is doing work on anti-colonial museum in the former Yugoslavia, and these collections of art from formerly colonized countries in Africa and other parts during Tito's Yugoslavia, and so there's extensive museum collections of non-Western art that are quite incredible and fascinating and really and they were acquired in very different ways than the colonial museums in the West. They were usually gifted to the socialist countries by the people, and so this is one way to kind of how these tremendous exchanges were also material exchanges, cultural exchanges. It is a whole different question, which I think had tremendous influence on what kind of visions of the world the socialist people imagined in the 70s and the 60s, and so and it's a whole different question. What is the current conditions of these collections right now, and so on. But this is just one example of that. For example, a multi-directional exchange. Maybe Zoltan has something to contribute.
Okay, we have one more question from Zoltan. Your hand is up.
Yes, thank you. Yes, as Zhivka said, she was right about that. I wanted to comment on this question. So just I'll be short, but I think it's important this was a very important question, because in current narratives, if we look at Eastern Europe, but specifically in Hungary, what you could see that there are these nationalist narratives of what we exported to, for example, African countries during this period, or our companies, our products and our achievements as they played out, in these formerly colonial spaces. So then it becomes this asymmetric narrative. And I think what's radical in this new research coming from the Global South is showing that, this was actually a negotiated relationship. And this was the most radical thing after the Second World War, that actually these Eastern European states could globalize in ways that they could now bypass the imperial powers and establish relationships with many of these decolonized countries directly. And they could not only have direct political and diplomatic relations, for example, Hungary with Ghana, already by the end of the 1950s, but also trade relations. So they could buy the products that they could otherwise could only buy through London, for example. Now they could buy it based on their own bilateral relations. So that was kind of what we often forget, that although these socialist states were very closed politically in trying to protect their own economies, and also there was national competition between social states too, within the Comecon, but we often forget that this was a radical globalization at that time. And lastly, there were these specific, by the end of the 1960s, specific tripartite industrial cooperations, which meant that usually there was a development, for example, in West Africa, an investment, and there was a Western partner and there was a partner from a socialist country, and they could work together on this investment project, which later on kind of reproduced this hierarchy of the core, semi-periphery, and the periphery in terms of what they did in the project. So from the West came the technology and much of the funds, and from the socialist countries came much of the work on, producing and building the investment. And usually there were also in the peripheries, the work was invested and the local resources were put in investment. But we often forget, and this is what Lukáš Stanek shows in his work, which we mentioned, that there was much more coming from these local decolonized countries in terms of knowledge, in terms of experience, and they were trained architects, trained engineers. Of course, the socialist countries in East Europe contributed to their training, but we often forget that they were equal partners in many of these projects. There was a very interesting quote in, I think, Lucas's work, that the Eastern Europeans had this experience that this is the first time that we get Black bosses, right? So these relationships are often forgotten, how they were actually played out. And these friendships and contacts later on very much influenced Eastern European architecture. So I advise you to read this work, which Zhivka also referred to.
Zoltan, I'm wondering if China entered also this picture, because China was very important in the 1970s in some African countries. So I wonder, in the kind of, can you tell us a little bit how it played out, because between these different partners, Eastern Europe, Africa, and China in those days?
Well, thank you for the question, but not much. And I think I'm also out of time, so I don't have time to elaborate. But I haven't specialized in China. But in one sentence, of course, there was a Sino-Soviet split in 1961, which pretty much influenced the competition. Formerly, they thought that it would be a joint socialist kind of intervention or influence in the region, but then it became, a more bitter competition. But that also resulted in, which later became more and more Chinese influence in the region, which propelled later on in the 1980s. And currently in the past 1 or 2 decades, it has become increasingly strong with a structural shift. But we must also not forget that there were other countries like Japan also involved, which were not socialist, but it's not just the political color that we need to think about, but the structural integration into and how you step into this competition.
Thank you.
So we're gonna take 2 more questions from Vicky Kasandi and Deboho Motapoli. And then we're gonna have a closing remarks from Prof. Makoni, and we're gonna jump straight to our after party. Vicky, would you love to go first? Because you asked a very interesting question on the chat box. Okay, Deboho, would you love to jump in?
Yes, good morning. And yes, I want to recall the two-way interaction between Eastern Europe and African countries. As a context, really, this was a Cold War period where both politically, let's just philosophically to start with, Eastern Europe wanted to be accepted communism, socialism as a legitimate option to capitalism. And giving scholarships to students endeared communism and socialism to the world, and it justified it. So Eastern Europe became an alternative to exploitative capitalism at that time in the context of Cold War politics. I noted in economic terms, Soviet Union provided machines, agricultural machines, buses, and even warplanes to Mozambique at that time. And they were in exchange given rights to fish around the waters of Mozambique. And they had more or less exclusive monopoly of that. And they sent technicians to mine, and they also actually took some young people from Mozambique to go and work in Eastern Europe. They worked in East Germany in the mines, and they were paid there. It was really a big economic exchange, and I think in the same way as now, for example, those countries which align themselves with the French, for example, are a bloc that the French would like to use in the United Nations to vote with them for any issue. So at that time, Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, even China, they obtained the votes from African countries that they supported with socialist solidarity. So there was some kind of something that Africans gave in exchange for any both scholarships or both educational and economic benefits. So I just wanted to clarify, yes, there was definitely. I remember a very big group of Mozambicans studying in China. Now, even now, the problem here is when you educate people, they come to appreciate and they favor you. So those students who've been trained in China now are not only bringing technology that Chinese may have to continue repairing. If they are doctors, the machines they bring, the Chinese will have to continue repairing. But the students themselves would favor and defend China together with all its authoritarian rule. They would say that's where we come from. That's our alma mater. That's where we were grown as experts. So there is much that the Chinese will get in return, and whenever China would like to exploit African countries, these people would defend it and say this is justified because we went to school there, they gave us scholarships, and we got the knowledge and the technology that we brought. So it doesn't only really affect or mean very solid, visible exchange. It also means psychological conviction and beginning to think that that is the best option, the best alternative. So the West, for example, would continue to try and criticize China about authoritarianism, but the people who studied there will still say, no, that is the best place where we got this advancement that the West could not give us. So there's always been, and there will always be tangible and intangible benefits to the exchange, to the privilege and benefits that are given by the Eastern European countries.
Okay.
I think that's all. Yeah.
Let me hand over to Prof. Makoni so that he can make his closing comments, and then we'll have Vishna or Kim to announce the next speaker or the speaker for next week.
Okay.
Professor Makoni, can I just say something?
Jump in,
I'm going
jump
to
in.
leave in a few minutes. Yes.
Yes, jump in, jump in.
I understand I understand the responses to the question that I asked, but the ultimate question still remains: to whose benefit? To whose benefit are all those things we have, talked about? So when, for example, the Chinese, train Africans and so on, and eventually, get their support, who is actually benefiting? So there's, they want something from the Africans. So they say, okay, we're going to give you this so that we can get this from you. So the exchange is not balanced. However you're going to look at it, the exchange is not balanced. So again, the question is, apart from the resources and a few other things, how much of African influence in any area, ideology, culturally, whatever, can you find in these other places? How much of African influence is in China? How much of African influence is in, Bulgaria or Russia or whatever, other country you're going to think of? That exchange is not balanced however you want to look at it. Because at the end of the day, it's not a win-win situation that the Chinese people talk about, because they win more. So what I'm trying to say is that the other countries win more than the African countries do at the end of the day when you add up everything. That's my point.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Junior. Thanks a lot. Before I...
Maybe...
Jump in. Yes.
If I can maybe just kind of very briefly, sort of, not in response, but just kind of to appreciate the contributions and the questions. I just want to say that these are very, very open questions. They are still very under-researched, extremely, I mean, we have this kind of macro structure analysis that's often also kind of talked about and contributes to, but like on a micro level, we need so much work to do in order to like understand the real impact and, what were the influences, for example, of African culture in Bulgaria, what did the people who, for example, worked in the African countries in Bulgaria, what did they bring with themselves? How did they enrich the society? And so I think that there's a lot of questions to kind of work through on a very, very, just like a kind of ethnographic level. Because these are things that are completely over. There's some Cold War frameworks that have overdetermined to such an extent our thinking about these questions that we need to very slowly, undo and sort of liberate ourselves from them. And this is just the beginning of this work. The beginning of this work and what actually happened in the 60s and the 70s. To kind of begin to kind of undo these erasures. And so I just won't say much more about this. Just wanted to say that I really appreciate your questions and your contributions.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me, before I just summarize and then hand over to Vishnu and Kip. Vicky, just jump in and say whatever you wanted to say, because this is the after party. What's your view about all this? Vicky is connecting with us from Kenya. Yeah, Vicky. Oh, okay. It looks
we
like...
don't quite hear you, Vicky. We are having some trouble hearing you, I think.
Prof, can Vishna or Kim announce the next speaker?
Okay.